Welcome to Greenwood's Legal's Employment Law Nowcast, episode 6. Today we're talking about the death of hybrid working. Enjoy the podcast. Hello and welcome to our Employment Law Nowcast, episode 6. In this episode, we are going to be talking about and debating the death of hybrid working. So I'm joined again by John Macaulay and Keith Williams, and I think it's worth me just starting off by very briefly recapping what we've all kind of been through and lived through since COVID, really. Because pre-COVID, which was only kind of 3.5 years ago, if we look back to kind of February 2020, no one really worked from home, I think it's fair to say, unless a specific arrangement had been agreed between employer and employee about, an actual agreement to arrange for them to do that. And then we're all catapulted, as I'm sure we all very firmly remember, into COVID, where we all had to work from home. And a lot of people adapted really quickly. There were some people that were key workers, still had to go to their places of work, but a lot of people that I know we dealt with worked from home. And since then, kind of as the world was starting to get back to normal, I certainly saw an uptick in demand for employer clients wanting hybrid working policies. So people were looking to kind of formalise the arrangements a bit more and wanted their employees to get back to the office for 2 days a week, 3 days a week was kind of the most common patterns that I saw. And then we thought it would be worth focusing on this for this podcast because we've started to see a bit of a shift again, and it's in the news a lot. And I know I am seeing, and I know both of you are as well, that employers are more and more keen to get their employees back to the office, either for the first time, if maybe they didn't go through that phase when the world was getting back to normal in COVID, or starting to increase the amount of time people are spending in the office. So I think it's really interesting. And in this podcast and in the next one as well, we'll start to talk about some of the challenges that employers might face if they want to do this. But what are the kinds of things we're seeing at the moment? Obviously, people could be remote all of the time, and obviously that was the case in very strict lockdown. But there are definitely kind of variations on that theme.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole range of different arrangements that we're seeing, and I think probably one of the most interesting points is working out whether every organisation is actually clear about what arrangement they have.
Yeah, I'm not sure they are really.
No, because I think there's a huge amount of inconsistency in many organisations as to how policies are applied and what people are actually doing. So you could have all sorts of things. You could have a sort of office first policy, which is predominantly in the office. That's the norm, but with a little bit of hybrid working, people being allowed to work from home occasionally. You could have sort of home first, sort of hybrid first, so people are predominantly allowed to work at home, but there's a requirement for people to come into the office occasionally. You could have an entirely remote working situation. And then you can have, within the sort of hybrid working arrangements, you can have sort of fixed hybrid where, you come into the office on certain specific days or whatever, or a flexible hybrid where people are basically given their own choice as to, they might be required to come in for a couple of days, but they can choose which days there are. And there's probably all sorts of other variations. And I think one of the starting points with this, and I'd kind of encourage anybody listening to just have a think about this, is in your organisation, what do you have? And is it actually consistent through the organisation? Because I suspect you may well find that different teams work differently, different departments work differently. I mean, obviously, there's going to be reasons. You mentioned in the introduction there that there were obviously key workers within the pandemic that still had to go into their place of work. And obviously, there will be certain jobs where people have had to carry on working as normal. But I think for those that can work from home, I bet there's an awful lot of differences between how different parts of the organisation work. So when we're thinking about, how do you approach this? I think you've first of all got to say, well, are we clear what we've actually got in our organisation? Is it consistent? Is it consistently applied? And one of the things we'll probably come back to talk about a little bit later on is, um, it may well be the case that certain people, if they're top performers, particularly important to the organisation, are given more latitude than others. So that kind of thing, I think, is probably something to have a think about.
Mm,
Yeah, I think there's going to be a mix of different methods of working, some of which are genuinely organisational. Different uh, teams within an organisation may be better suited, but there's also going to be some sort of personal preference. Individual managers may have a preference for their teams working from home, so more sort of subjective and personalised reason for there being differences within the organisation that may not necessarily be obvious if you were simply looking at how are we organising things. So there may even be variations within organisations that organisationally aren't really very clear or particularly clearly justified or explained, but it's simply a matter of personal preference.
Well, I mean, if you just look at the two of us, we're partners in the same office. You really prefer working in the office. You always work in the office. I'm somebody who I quite like to do both, and I think it must affect how you view the whole idea of it, and as to whether you're thinking, oh, I think it's a really good idea, or it's not a good idea, or how much do we need people to be back. So I think that whole thing of sort of personal preference,
Yeah.
particularly with this topic, is going to be
And to a certain extent, that's sort of a form of moral authority as well. It would be easier for me to be saying to people, I think you should be in the office more because I'm there all the time, than if you were trying to insist that people were in the office when you weren't going to be in the office yourself. It may be harder for you to sort of objectively rationalize why people need to be in the office when you aren't necessarily being there yourself.
And I think that to do with businesses as well, because we'll come on in a minute to Zoom. The type of organisation that you are, and the sort of type of business that you are, I think also maybe either makes it easier or more difficult to potentially push a certain way forward.
I think there's two really interesting points there, that actually we all work, we've all got a preferred way of working, and so naturally we are all going to kind of prefer a certain thing. And linked to that, I think if organisations are looking to, for example, say, okay, we have a bit of an informal arrangement going on at the moment, but we want people back to the office 4 days a week, picking up on your point, John, where we might all be starting from different points, I think it might maybe be unrealistic to then expect, if we're requiring everyone to come back 4 days a week, if they're all starting from different points, is that going to lead to different outcomes? And that's something that we'll address, I'm sure, as we go on.
Well,
Either
the impact is massively different
on different people, depending on
how they've actually approached it so far. And I think you've got a whole range of different possibilities. And again, because there won't be that consistency, we do just have to kind of think about that when we're looking at how you approach it.
So Starbucks and Zoom then, I know we've looked at a couple of these. You mentioned Zoom a minute ago, and Starbucks as well. Obviously, if you want a coffee made for you, someone's got to be physically there making it for you. So I know we've looked at a couple of these in preparation. What approaches are these very large companies taking for getting employees physically back to their workspaces?
So I thought that probably the two most interesting ones in contrasting were Starbucks and Zoom, not in the sense of the fact that they're trying to achieve something different, because I think they're both trying to achieve people back in the office more. But I think just the nature of the business, because Starbucks, when they indicated as of January the 30th, their sort of CEO said that they wanted people to be back in the office more often. But the reasons they put forward they were quite compelling, I thought, because of the nature of their business. So they were saying, look, we're a company, as they put it, rooted in human connection. So it's all about people getting together in a coffee shop and, you know, sharing stories and all of that sort of thing, sharing experiences. And so they were kind of comparing that whole ethos with the idea, but actually the people who work in the business kind of never see each other. So it's kind of like, we're all about human connection. Human connection is good, therefore we need you back, and it's part of our business ethos. And they also referred to fairness. So that was a sort of a reference to the inconsistency point we just talked about, in terms of different people might actually be coming in, different periods of time. So somebody might be supposed to be coming in a couple of days a week, but actually some people are coming in one day, some people are coming in 3 days. And they were saying that we need to get more fairness in how this is all applied. And then they talked about correcting what they call unintended consequences that have emerged from conducting so much of our work virtually. So that was all the stuff which we do see regularly in these sorts of statements about lack of collaboration, lack of creative thought, that kind of thing. So the idea that if you're all in the office together, then there's an element of that that's just really going to help in terms of generating creative ideas and people collaborating with each other.
We were having a conversation about that the other day, weren't we? About kind of the water cooler chat and that kind of thing, and how valuable is it to workplaces, whereas at home maybe time would be wasted, in a different way.
Yeah, and certainly you see commentary, the commentary is really split on that, isn't it? With some people saying how important that is to a business culture, and then you'll get other people weighing in that it's a colossal waste of their time, and they get caught at the water cooler when they could be at their desk doing work, and that wouldn't happen if they were safely tucked up at home, not being interrupted by their pesky colleagues. So it's a real division. I suppose it must be an issue for Starbucks as well, because it's been all over the press how tough it has been for city centre businesses that sell food to office workers, so coffee shops and sandwich shops, and people not being in, especially if you go into central London, if you go into the city on a Friday now, it's a bit like a ghost town. So the fact that Starbucks actually rely on office workers going into work in their office, and then nipping out and buying a Starbucks when they want a drink, you can absolutely see Starbucks' point of view that they want to encourage people to be more moving that direction than a more home working model.
Yeah, and they also referred to things like prioritizing and operational decision making, and suggesting that that's more difficult if you're working in silos at home. I mean, query whether that's right, because I think the mere fact that you're working from home, I don't think means that you have to be working in a silo. But they're kind of suggesting that if you're not actually in an office with your colleagues, it can make all of that stuff more difficult. But just coming back to the point of Starbucks as a business, it's quite a compelling argument, I thought, to say, we're all about bringing people together, so let's bring all our staff together, and to the extent that you can do it. But then you've got Zoom, where, and I think you said this earlier on, Keith, when we were talking, they're kind of selling the dream of being able to work anywhere. And yet they're now saying, well, we want our workers to be back in an office. Now, I think, just from the point of view, if you were launching a campaign to get your staff back, I'd much rather be the CEO of Starbucks than I would the CEO of Zoom, in terms of just being able to credibly say, this is what I think we should be doing. And their rationale hasn't been as I haven't seen so much on their rationale, but it seems to be around, certainly I've seen some commentary that it's about, the sort of impact of things like Microsoft in terms of really putting pressure on Zoom in terms of, commercially. But, my thought on that was, it seems to suggest that actually, if you're under commercial pressure and you really need to operate at top level, you have to have everybody back in an office, which again would be something that I think a lot of people would debate as to whether that's true or
Yeah,
not.
it's this sort of tacit acceptance by Zoom that people aren't as productive if they're working from home,
Mm.
which kind of contradicts their business model a
Yes.
bit. And
Yeah.
as you say, the dream they're trying to sell to their customers.
Yeah. So, and obviously, there's all sorts of others. There's Disney, again, seeking to have people back. And I would say that idea of creativity is one that crops up a lot in creative businesses. The idea of, creative thought flourishes far better if you're all in an office together. And again, I think it's all a matter of opinion, but for me, that sounds like quite a compelling argument that
Yeah.
if you're in a creative business, having a lot of people in a room bouncing ideas off each other might well be, I think, more productive than trying to do that on a Zoom call. But who knows?
Yeah, and I think it goes for all businesses. I've been dealing with a few clients over the last few months who are trying to push the return to office working a lot harder than they have done, having been relatively relaxed over the last 3 or so years. Not really pushing it once the legal restrictions on having people back in the office, once they were relaxed, they've allowed people to continue working from home. I'm just thinking one that's literally on my desk upstairs at the moment that I'm assisting a client with, and they're a large business, but they're a large business, over 1,000 employees, and one of their offices they're sort of doing it bit by bit, and one of their offices they've required all of the people who work in that office to return to office working, pretty much 100% office working, unless there are good reasons that they can give as to why they should continue working from home. And the reasoning that they're giving my client is around they feel that over the last few years they've really lost a lot of the culture of the business. People are working more in isolation, they're not collaborating. In particular, they have quite a strong apprenticeship and trainee program, and they feel that those more junior employees who are just learning their trade are missing out because they're not having people to just sort of observe and kind of learn from osmosis. But with people that they've asked to come back to the office, they've had a, just over 40 flexible working requests come in, and I think it's fascinating really, because it absolutely gives really the full cross section of the reasons why employees might be giving for not wanting to come back to the office after 3 years or so. So there's inevitably a significant chunk of people who are asking not to come back because of childcare needs, and that's approaching 20 they've got there, and some of them are really quite compelling. And of course, my client is dealing with those appropriately and granting flexible working requests where that happens. There's also a certain cohort of people who are raising concerns because of health conditions or disabilities, and either that makes it more difficult for them to travel to their place of work, or their place of work isn't. They don't feel is as well set up to cope with their physical disabilities as perhaps they've got their home work environment now. People with neurodiversity conditions who are a lot more comfortable working at home in a more private location rather than going back into an open plan office that they haven't done for several years. And then it's right through the spectrum to things that don't really fall within those particular protected characteristics, but nonetheless, for the people that are raising the concerns, are clearly relevant issues. So, for example, one person who got a rescue dog during lockdown, and they could do that on the basis that they were going to be at home some of the time and their partner was going to be at home some of the time. Their partner still is at home, but what that would mean is the dog being left alone 3 days a week. Now, you might, potentially, some people might say, well, that's trivial. It's a dog, and why did you get a dog if you needed to be at home to look after the dog rather than coming to work? But that's as maybe. It's a real issue for anyone that's got a dog. They will appreciate how real an issue it is that if you've now got the dog and you've had the dog for a couple of years and it can't be left at home by itself, it's a major issue for you that isn't very easy to deal with. And yet you could put it into some sort of daycare facility, but that's not cheap. You may be spending hundreds of pounds a month doing that. So there's that issue that on the face of it, you might think is somewhat trivial, but in reality, it's a major issue for
and the strength
people.
of feeling that those things generate are massive. Because we were talking about this upstairs before the podcast. Somebody overheard us, and we had somebody saying it's absolutely ridiculous that somebody could, have a dog and then think that they're going to be allowed to work from home. And then somebody else was immediately chipping in saying, but depends what their employer said to them about whether they would be required to come back into the office. And
it was a very different time during peak COVID, and it seemed like we were never going to get back to normal. And whilst we kind of achieved that now, your rescue dog hasn't gone away.
Yeah, and I think the key thing is that in terms of trying to introduce some sort of new policy or shift your policy, you're going to have those really strong, almost polarized views among different people as to whether it's a perfectly reasonable thing to do or actually it's a really big ask.
Yeah.
And you just see that almost probably more than any other issue that we've come across. It has such a massive impact on the way people live their lives that they're going to have really strong views one way or another.
That's been really interesting. Thank you. I think we'll leave it there for today. And in the next episode, we'll start to look at some of the things employers should be thinking about if they want to either change how their employees are working or increase the amount of time their employees are in the office. Thank you.